The summer of 1940. The world held its breath. An invasion of Britain seemed certain. The only thing standing in the way was a small group of young men in fighter planes. We call it the Battle of Britain. It lasted 112 days. The average age of a Royal Air Force pilot was just 20 years old. 1 in 6 of them would not survive. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had more planes, more pilots, and more experience. On paper, they should have won, but they didn't. We think we know the story. We picture Spitfires twisting in the summer sky. We hear Winston Churchill's famous words about the few. But the real story is stranger than that. It's filled with unbelievable moments, secret systems, and human dramas that are often left out of the history books. What if the battle was turned by a single navigational error by a lost bomber crew? What if some of the most successful pilots weren't British at all, but foreigners who were initially mistrusted and sidelined? And what if the man who engineered the whole victory was fired almost as soon as it was over? These aren't just stories of heroes in the sky. They are stories of arguments in underground bunkers, of women staring at radar screens, of legless pilots, and of human error changing the course of history. The things that happened that summer are more complex, more controversial, and more unbelievable than you can imagine. Number 15, what does a boy know of fear? Jaffrey Wellham was a boy. He was 18 years old when he was sent to join 92 Squadron. He had just learned to fly. He looked so young that the other pilots called him boy. His book, First Light, is one of the most honest accounts of being a fighter pilot ever written. You know, it doesn't talk about glory. It talks about fear, confusion, and exhaustion. He arrived at the airfield in the middle of the battle. It was a factory of stress. The pilots were veterans. They had hard eyes. They didn't have time for a new kid. Wellham was thrown in at the deep end. He describes his first combat patrol. He was flying a Spitfire, one of the best fighter planes in the world. But he was terrified. He was trying to remember his training. Check your instruments, watch your leader, watch the sky. The sky was huge and empty. Then suddenly it was full of black dots. The enemy. His account is not heroic. It's chaotic. He writes about the sheer sensory overload, the roar of the engine, the rattle of the machine guns, the smell of cordite and hot oil, the desperate need to breathe. He saw planes exploding. He saw parachutes. He didn't know if they were friends or enemies. He just tried to stay alive. He wasn't thinking about saving Britain. He was thinking about not getting killed in the next 5 seconds. His story is a vital counterpoint to the legend. The pilots weren't superheroes. They were teenagers and young men. They were given a powerful, expensive machine and told to go fight. Many of them, like Wellham, felt like imposters. They were just trying to keep up. The mental strain was immense. The pilots talked about the twitch. It was a constant state of anxiety. Every nerve was frayed. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat. They saw the faces of their friends who didn't come back from the last patrol. Wellham survived. He flew patrol after patrol through August and September, the most intense period of the fighting. He saw the battle from the cockpit. He saw the shift in German tactics from attacking coastal targets to airfields and then to London. He describes the exhaustion as a physical weight. He would land, refuel, and go back up, sometimes 3, 4, or 5 times a day. He lost friends. He grew old in a matter of weeks. By the end of the battle, Jaffrey Wellham was still a teenager. But the boy was gone. He had seen too much. His story, and others like it, force us to look past the propaganda. The few were not fearless gods. They were ordinary young men, pushed to an extraordinary limit. The historian James Holland, in his book Battle of Britain, emphasizes this human cost. He notes that the constant stress led to high rates of operational exhaustion. Pilots were often more likely to be taken off flying duties due to mental breakdown than physical injury. The system was brutal. It burned through pilots as quickly as it burned through fuel and ammunition. Jaffrey Wellham's unbelievable story is not that he shot down planes. It's that he survived at all. He survived the enemy, and he survived the crushing weight of his own fear. What do we still not know? We have the diaries and memoirs, but how many pilots suffered in total silence, their stories of mental anguish never recorded? How many young men were pushed back into the cockpit when they were psychologically broken, their silent screams for help ignored in the name of duty? Was there a hidden epidemic of combat stress that was deliberately covered up by the authorities to maintain morale? Number 14 was the real weapon, a map and a telephone. You know, we imagine the Battle of Britain was won in the air, Spitfires and Hurricanes versus Messerschmitts. That's only half the story. The most important weapon the British had was invisible. It was a system. And it was revolutionary. It was called the Dowding System, named after the man who built it, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding was the head of fighter command. He was quiet, reserved, and some found him difficult. But he was a visionary. In the years before the war, he understood something fundamental. It wasn't enough to have good planes. You had to know where the enemy was, and you had to get your planes to the right place at the right time. The English Channel is wide, but a fast bomber can cross it in minutes. Scrambling fighters to patrol randomly was a waste of fuel, machines, and pilots. It was a losing game, so Dowding built a network. It started with a new technology called radio direction finding, or RDF. We call it radar. It was a chain of towers along the British coast. They sent out radio pulses and listened for the echoes. These echoes could detect incoming aircraft from over 100 miles away. It was like giving Britain eyes that could see over the horizon. But that was just the first step. The information from the radar towers was raw data. It had to be interpreted. This is where the next part of the system came in. The data was phoned to a central filter room. Here, mostly women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAF worked around a massive map table. They took the reports from different radar stations and triangulated the enemy's position, height, speed, and direction. They created a single, clear picture of the incoming raid. This was a high-pressure job. A single mistake could be catastrophic. Once the raid was plotted, the information was passed to the group operations room. This was the brain. The controller, sitting on a balcony overlooking another huge map table, would look at the enemy raid markers and the available RAF squadrons. Using long magnetic rakes, WAAFs would move the blocks representing friend and foe across the map. The controller would make the decision. Scramble 74 Squadron, Vector 120, Angels 15. This meant get 74 Squadron airborne, fly on a heading of 120 degrees, and climb to 15,000 feet. The orders were then relayed to the airfields, and the pilots would run to their planes. The final link was the Observer Corps. These were civilian volunteers, often too old for military service. They stood in fields and on rooftops with binoculars and a simple plotting instrument. Once the enemy planes crossed the coast, they were beyond the full view of coastal radar. The Observer Corps provided the eyes and ears inland, tracking the raids visually and phoning in updates. Their reports were crucial for guiding the fighters to the bombers. This entire system, from radar to filter room to operations room to the Observer Corps, was the weapon. As detailed by historian Stephen Bungay in The Most Dangerous Enemy, this was the world's first integrated air defense system. The Luftwaffe had nothing like it. Their pilots flew into a void expecting to find patrolling fighters. Instead, they were met by squadrons that seemed to appear from nowhere, exactly where they were, attacking from the perfect height and angle. It seemed like magic. It wasn't magic. It was the Dowding System. It allowed a smaller force to fight a larger one with incredible efficiency. It saved planes, fuel, and most importantly, the lives of the pilots. The battle was won not just by brave men in cockpits, but by quiet men in offices, dedicated women in underground rooms, and old men in fields with binoculars. What parts of this system remain secret even today? Were there experimental listening posts or other detection methods we were never told about? How many times did the system fail, leading to unreported friendly fire incidents or raids getting through unopposed? And just how close did German intelligence come to understanding the full extent of this network before it was too late? Number 13, could a disagreement between two men have lost the war? History loves simple stories, good versus evil, heroes and villains, but reality is messy. The men in charge of Britain's air defense were not a united team. They were rivals, and their central argument was so fierce it could have cost Britain the battle. This was the Big Wing controversy. On one side was Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. He commanded 11 Group, which covered London and the southeast. It was the most important area. He was a New Zealander. He was pragmatic, hands-on, and a brilliant tactician. He had been a fighter pilot himself. He was Dowding's key man on the ground. Park believed in meeting the enemy with what you had as quickly as you could. His strategy was to send up squadrons in small, flexible formations. 1 or 2 squadrons would hit the German bombers on their way in. Another would hit them over the target. A third would attack them as they fled back to France. This meant the raiders were under constant attack. It also meant that if a squadron missed the enemy, it wasn't a total disaster. Other squadrons were still in the fight. It was efficient and reactive. On the other side was Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. He commanded 12 Group, which covered the Midlands, to the north of Park's area. He was ambitious and politically skilled. Leigh-Mallory and one of his most famous squadron leaders, Douglas Bader, had a different idea. They argued for the big wing. They wanted to assemble a massive formation of 3, 4, or even 5 squadrons at once. This huge wing would then be sent to smash the enemy raid in a single decisive blow. On paper, it sounded devastating. A huge formation of British fighters would have overwhelming firepower. The problem was time. It took a long time to get that many squadrons from different airfields airborne and formed up into a single fighting unit. By the time the big wing was ready, the German bombers had often already dropped their bombs and were on their way home. Park constantly complained that he would ask for help from 12 Group, and either nothing would come, or a big wing would show up far too late to be of any use in protecting his vital airfields. The debate raged throughout the summer. Leigh-Mallory and Bader argued that Park's small squadron tactics were not inflicting enough damage. They claimed the big wing was the war-winning weapon. Park and Dowding countered that protecting the targets was the priority. Destroying bombers after they had already destroyed an airfield was a hollow victory. The clash became personal and bitter. As historian Richard Overy documents in The Battle of Britain, the Myth and the Reality, the conflict was not just tactical but also political, with Leigh-Mallory using his connections in the Air Ministry to undermine Park and Dowding. On a few occasions, the big wing did work spectacularly. On September 15th, a massive German raid was met by a large formation, including a big wing from 12 Group. The sight of so many British fighters shocked the German crews and helped make the day a turning point. But supporters of Dowding and Park argued that this was a rare success. For most of the battle, the big wing was too slow, too cumbersome, and left vital targets undefended while it was being assembled. The feud was a distraction and a drain on resources at a critical time. Park's flexible response, while less dramatic, was what ultimately wore the Luftwaffe down day after day. The argument wasn't settled in 1940, it was only settled by history. What if Leigh-Mallory had won the argument earlier? Would assembling big wings have left London and the airfields so vulnerable that fighter command would have been destroyed on the ground? How many private letters and documents from this bitter feud were later destroyed to present a unified front to the public? Was there an act of outright insubordination during the battle that was covered up to prevent a scandal? Number 12. Did a lost bomber change the world? History can turn on a single moment, a single decision, or a single mistake. On the night of August 24th, 1940, a handful of German bombers got lost. They were supposed to bomb all tanks at Thameshaven and a factory at Rochester, but in the darkness and confusion of flying over a blacked-out country, they made a navigational error. Their bombs fell on London. It was an accident. At this point in the war, the German High Command had a specific directive forbidding attacks on the capital. They believed that bombing civilians would only stiffen British resolve. They wanted to win the war by destroying the Royal Air Force, not by terrorizing the population. The bombs that fell that night were not part of a grand strategy. They were a mistake. But in London, nobody knew that. All they knew was that the capital had been bombed. The public was outraged. Winston Churchill was a man who understood the political power of symbolism. He saw an opportunity. He ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. On the night of August 25th, a small force of British bombers flew all the way to the German capital and dropped their bombs. The physical damage to Berlin was minimal, but the psychological damage was immense. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously promised the German people that an enemy bomb would never fall on their capital. He had boasted, "If an enemy bomber reaches Berlin, you can call me Meyer." Now the air raid sirens were wailing in the heart of the Third Reich. The leadership was humiliated, and the supreme leader was furious. He made a fateful decision. He ordered a change in strategy. The Luftwaffe was to switch its attacks from the RAF's airfields and radar stations to London itself. The goal was no longer to just defeat fighter command. The new goal was to terrorize the city into submission and break British morale. The Blitz was about to begin. On September 7th, 1940, the first massive daylight raid on London occurred. Hundreds of bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, flew up the Thames. The RAF, which had been expecting another attack on their airfields, was caught by surprise. The London docks were set ablaze. This was a terrifying moment for the people of London, but for fighter command, it was a lifeline. In late August and early September, the RAF was on the verge of breaking. The relentless attacks on the 11 Group airfields were taking a terrible toll. Hitting airfields were cratered, hangars were burning, ground crews were being killed. The entire command and control system was stretched to its limit. Historians like Len Dighton in his book, Fight of the True Story of the Battle of Britain, argue that a few more weeks of this pressure could have led to a collapse. The switch to bombing London was a strategic blunder for the Germans. It gave the battered airfields of 11 Group a chance to recover. It gave the exhausted pilots and ground crews a breathing space. The battle was now over London, not over the RAF bases. And fighting over your home city gives you a powerful motivation. The focus of the battle had shifted, all because a few bomber crews had gotten lost in the dark. What do we still not know about this pivotal moment? Were there other accidental bombings of British cities that were deliberately downplayed by the government to avoid panic? Is it possible the London bombing wasn't an accident, but a rogue act by a single commander that was later officially denied? What if Churchill had not retaliated against Berlin? Would the Luftwaffe have continued to hammer the airfields, perhaps to a final decisive victory? Number 11. Who were the real top guns of the battle? The image of the Battle of Britain is of the English pilot, the charming, polite, public schoolboy defending his homeland. But this image is a myth. The truth is, the Royal Air Force was a multinational force, and some of its most lethal pilots were not British at all. They were men who had already lost their own countries. They were the Poles. When their country was overrun in 1939, thousands of Polish airmen escaped. They made their way to France, and when France fell, they came to Britain. They were experienced, skilled, and absolutely furious. They had a burning desire for revenge, but initially the RAF didn't know what to do with them. They were seen as undisciplined. They spoke little English, they were given menial jobs, some British commanders doubted their ability. As the battle intensified and the RAF began to run out of pilots, this attitude changed. They had to let the Poles fly. The most famous was 303 Squadron. It was formed in August 1940, made up of Polish pilots with a few British officers. When they finally entered the battle at the end of August, they were a revelation. The Polish pilots fought differently. The RAF had been trained in neat, formal tactics. The Poles had learned to fight in a desperate, chaotic air war over their own country. They were aggressive, almost reckless. They had superb eyesight and incredible situational awareness. They tended to attack from much closer ranges, ensuring a kill. Their tactics were brutal and effective. In their first week of combat, they were shooting down German planes at an astonishing rate. The numbers are incredible. During the Battle of Britain, 303 Squadron claimed 126 enemy aircraft destroyed. This was the highest score of any squadron in fighter command. Its top ace, Witold Urbinowicz, claimed 17 victories. Josef František, a Czech pilot flying with the squadron, was one of the highest scoring aces of the entire battle, with 17 confirmed kills in just 1 month before his death in a crash. As documented by historians like Adam Zamoyski in The Forgotten Few, the contribution of these foreign pilots was out of all proportion to their numbers. There were 145 Polish pilots in the battle. They shot down over 200 German aircraft. Their success was not without friction. Their aggressive tactics sometimes broke RAF formations, and their eagerness to engage could be seen as a lack of discipline. But no one could argue with the results. They were warriors, not sportsmen. For them, this was not a gentleman's duel. It was a fight for their very existence, a chance to strike back at the regime that had destroyed their homes. Alongside the Poles were Czechs, Belgians, French, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, and even a handful of Americans who had joined before their country was in the war. The Battle of Britain was not just Britain's fight, it was a world fight. And the forgotten few, the pilots from occupied Europe, were arguably its most determined and deadly combatants. They had lost everything, which made them the most dangerous kind of enemy. But what don't we know about their story? How much official prejudice did they face behind the scenes, and were records of this later sanitized? Were there tensions within the squadrons that we never hear about, fueled by language barriers and different combat philosophies? And after the war, when their countries fell under a new form of tyranny, how many of these heroes were abandoned by the very country they helped to save? Number 10. How do you fly a Spitfire with no legs? Douglas Bader was a celebrity. He was handsome, arrogant, and one of the most famous pilots of the war. He was also a double amputee. His story is one of the most unbelievable of the entire conflict. It's a testament to pure, stubborn willpower. In 1931, Bader was a young, promising RAF pilot. He was known for being a bit of a show-off. During a low-level aerobatics display, he crashed. The surgeons had to amputate both of his legs, one above the knee, one below. His career as a pilot was over. The RAF discharged him. For most people, that would have been the end of the story, but not for Douglas Bader. He spent the next few years learning to walk and even play golf on artificial tin legs. He was determined to live a normal life. When war broke out in 1939, he saw his chance. He badgered the Air Ministry relentlessly. He pulled every string he could. He demanded to be let back in. He insisted he could still fly. The regulations said it was impossible, but Bader refused to take no for an answer. Eventually, in a system desperate for experienced pilots, they gave in. They let him try. He passed the flight test easily. His control over the aircraft was perfect. In some ways, his artificial legs were an advantage. He couldn't feel the crushing G-forces in his lower body, which made him less likely to black out in a tight turn. He was given command of 242 Squadron, a unit made up mostly of Canadians that had been badly mauled in the Battle of France. Their morale was low. Bader transformed them. His personality was electric. He was loud, demanding, and utterly confident. He swore at them, he pushed them, and he led from the front. He rebuilt their confidence. He also became the leading advocate for the big wing tactic, arguing that sending up huge formations of fighters was the best way to destroy the enemy. He clashed with Keith Park and Hugh Dowding, who favored more flexible tactics. Bader was not a man who compromised. In the air, he was a formidable fighter. He led his squadron with aggression and skill. The image of a man with no legs leading a fighter squadron into battle was an incredible propaganda tool. The public loved him. He was proof that Britain could not be defeated, that its spirit was unbreakable. Books like Reach for the Sky by Paul Brickhill immortalized his story. His personal combat record during the battle is a matter of some historical debate. Some claims may have been exaggerated in the fog of war and by his celebrity status. But what is not in doubt is his leadership. He turned a broken squadron into one of the most effective units in fighter command. He gave them belief, and his very presence in the cockpit was a symbol of defiance that was worth more than a dozen squadrons. He simply refused to be beaten by his disability or by the enemy. It was an unbelievable act of will. But what are the unanswered questions about Douglas Bader? Behind the bravado and the fame, what was the psychological toll of his disability and the constant pressure to be a hero? How much of the big wing debate was driven by his personality and ego rather than pure tactical logic? And were there other disabled pilots who tried to fly again but were rejected? Their stories lost because they lacked Bader's powerful connections and sheer force of will. Number 9. What happens when you run out of bullets? It was September 15th, 1940. This day is now known as Battle of Britain Day. It was one of the largest and most ferocious air battles of the entire campaign. The Luftwaffe sent 2 massive waves of bombers and fighters to attack London. Fighter Command threw everything it had at them. The sky over southern England was filled with planes. Flying in that chaotic sky was Sergeant Ray Holmes of 504 Squadron. He was in his Hurricane, a tough, rugged fighter plane. He had already been in combat that day. Now he was up again, flying towards a huge formation of German bombers. He picked out his target, a Dornier 17 bomber, and opened fire. He saw his bullets hitting the plane. He kept firing until his ammunition was gone. The bomber was damaged, but it was still flying. For most pilots, that would be the end of it. Head for home, rearm, and try again. But Ray Holmes was not most pilots, and this was not most days. He was watching the bomber continue on its course towards central London, specifically towards Buckingham Palace. He was filled with a cold fury. He was not going to let that happen. He made a split-second decision. If he couldn't shoot it down, he would knock it down. He flew his Hurricane directly at the bomber. He aimed for the tail. His plan was to use his wing to slice off the bomber's rear stabilizers, sending it out of control. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, a tactic of last resort. It was something you read about, not something people actually did. He hit the bomber at over 200 miles per hour. The collision was violent. Holmes managed to shear off the bomber's entire rear tail section, but the impact also ripped the wing off his own Hurricane. His plane went into an uncontrollable dive. He was thrown around the cockpit. He managed to bail out his parachute opening just in time. He landed on the roof of a nearby building. The German crew also bailed out and were captured. The wreckage of the 2 planes fell to earth. Parts of the Dornier bomber landed on the forecourt of Victoria Station. It was a spectacular public end to an air battle. Ray Holmes became an instant hero. His act of ramming the enemy was seen as the ultimate expression of defiance. The story, captured by newsreels and newspapers, became a defining moment of the battle. It was proof of the do-or-die spirit of the RAF pilots. This kind of deliberate ramming attack, called Terran by the Soviets, who used it more frequently, was exceptionally rare in the RAF. As historian Dilip Sarkar notes in his detailed studies of the battle, it was not a taught or encouraged tactic. It was an act of pure individual desperation and courage. Ray Holmes had an empty gun, a full heart, and a stubborn refusal to let the enemy pass. He turned his entire aircraft into a single guided bullet. What questions remain about this incredible act? Were there other unrecorded ramming attacks during the battle, perhaps by pilots who did not survive to tell the tale? How much pressure were pilots under to press home the attack, and did this lead some to take risks that bordered on the suicidal? And was the story later embellished by propaganda, or was the reality of that moment over London even more chaotic and terrifying than the official reports suggest? Number 8, who were the real eyes of the battle? The pilots were the stars of the show. They were the knights of the air. But behind every pilot in the sky was a team on the ground. And a crucial part of that team was the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF, specifically the women who worked as radar operators and plotters. They were the hidden figures of the victory. Imagine a small dark room, often underground in a bunker. It's stuffy and smells of stale air and ozone from the electronic equipment. This is a radar station. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, is staring at a cathode ray tube. It's a flickering green screen. On it, a small blip of light appears. She has to interpret that blip. Is it a flock of birds? A ghost signal? Or is it 100 enemy bombers heading for London? She has to make the call, and she has to be right. Her report is the first link in the entire air defense chain. This was the reality for thousands of WAFs. As described in books like The WAF in Wartime by Beryl E. Escott, these women were thrust into highly technical and stressful jobs with little prior experience. They were trained to become the eyes of fighter command. From the coastal radar stations, the information flowed to the filter rooms. Here, more WAFs stood around a huge map of Britain. They wore headsets, receiving a constant stream of reports. Hostile 3-0, 40+, Angels 1-5. This was code. It meant a raid of over 40 enemy aircraft had been spotted at 15,000 feet in a specific grid square. The plotter would take a wooden block representing the raid and place it on the map. As new reports came in, she would update its position. They had to work quickly, calmly, and with total accuracy. The fate of cities and the lives of pilots depended on it. This information was then passed to the main operations rooms of the fighter groups. Here, the scene was even more dramatic. GWAFs moved the counters across the vast map table with long rakes, tracking the battle in real time. The senior controllers, all men, sat on a balcony above, looking down like gods watching a chess game. But the ones moving the pieces, the ones making the whole system work, were the women on the floor. They were not just passive assistants. They were active participants in the battle. They heard the stress in the voices coming through their headphones. They knew which squadron was being scrambled. They followed the battle as it unfolded, block by block, on their map. They knew when a squadron had been hit, when its counter was removed from the board. They often knew the pilots personally. They shared the tension, the fear, and the rare moments of triumph. They worked long, grueling shifts under immense pressure. An attack could come at any time, day or night, yet their story is often overlooked, a footnote to the more glamorous tale of the fighter aces. Without them, the Dowding System would have been a collection of useless technology. They were the human processors that turned raw data into a clear picture of the battle. They made sense of the chaos. What don't we know about the role of these women? How much psychological stress did they endure, and was there any support system for them? Were there instances where a plotting error led to a major disaster, a story that was quietly buried? And how much resistance was there initially within the male-dominated RAF to giving women such critical operational roles? Number 7, how do you fight someone you don't hate? War creates an image of the enemy. They are evil, faceless, a monster to be destroyed. This is essential for propaganda. It makes it easier for soldiers and pilots to do their job, but the reality in the air was sometimes more complicated. The men fighting each other were just that, men. They were young, they were pilots, and they shared a unique bond of facing death in the sky, even if they were on opposite sides. There are many stories from the War of Chivalry and respect between fighter pilots. During the Battle of Britain, this was less common. The fighting was too intense, the stakes too high, but moments of humanity still broke through the hate. And pilots on both sides would sometimes watch a bailed out airman in his parachute, making sure he wasn't shot at, which was considered a war crime by both sides, though it sometimes happened. There's the story of German fighter ace Adolf Galland. He was one of their top pilots. He was a professional, not a fanatic. He had a deep respect for his opponents in the RAF. He famously complained to Goring that his fighters needed to be equipped with cannons like the Spitfire. His relationship with the high command was often strained because he was a realist. He saw the strengths of the RAF and the weaknesses of his own side's strategy. Or consider Joseph Phipps Priller. He was another German ace who flew throughout the battle. In his memoirs, he doesn't write with ideological fervor. He writes like a pilot. He talks about tactics, about the performance of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, about the fear and the adrenaline. He describes the RAF pilots as tough and skilled opponents. There is a sense of professional rivalry, not deep-seated hatred. This was his job, and he was good at it. On the British side, there was a strange mix of feelings. When a German plane was shot down, there was celebration. But when the pilot was captured, he was often treated with a degree of curiosity and even respect. There are accounts of downed German pilots being brought to the officers' mess at an RAF airfield. They would share a drink and talk pilot to pilot. They would discuss the merits of their different aircraft. They would talk about tactics. For a brief moment, they were not enemies, but members of the same exclusive, dangerous club. This was not universal, of course. For a pilot who had just seen his best friend killed, the sight of a captured German airman could provoke fury. And I just sailor on the ground who had been bombed, were often less than welcome to enemy crews who perished. But these moments of shared humanity are a powerful reminder that war is not as simple as the posters make it out to be. The men in the cockpits, as noted by author Patrick Bishop in Fighter Boys, had more in common with each other than with the generals and politicians on the ground who had sent them to fight. What stories of fraternization between pilots have been lost to time? Were there secret truces or safe zones over the channel that were never officially acknowledged? How many pilots on both sides chose not to take a fatal shot at a helpless enemy, an act of mercy that could never be reported? And did intelligence agencies from both sides try to exploit this pilot to pilot respect for their own ends? Number 6, what is more terrifying than the enemy? On September 6, 1939, just 3 days after Britain declared war, the new radar system picked up a large number of aircraft heading towards London. This was it, the dreaded knockout blow from the air that everyone feared. The sirens wailed, fighter squadrons were scrambled. The entire defense system lurched into action for the first time. RAF fighters raced to intercept the incoming raid. But when they got there, they found a problem. There were no German bombers, there was nothing. It was a false alarm, a glitch in the new, untested radar system. In the confusion and panic, with pilots on edge and radio communication still primitive, the unthinkable happened. 2 British Spitfires engaged what they believed to be the enemy. They shot down 2 British Hurricanes. The first RAF fighter pilot to be killed in the war was shot down by his own side. This incident became known as the Battle of Barking Creek. It was a disaster and a humiliation. It highlighted the terrifying danger of friendly fire. In the chaos of a 3-dimensional air battle, with dozens of planes twisting and turning, it is incredibly difficult to correctly identify an aircraft in a split second. The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had similar wing shapes. From the wrong angle, in the wrong light, a friend could look like a foe. The incident was immediately covered up, the official records were sealed, the public was told the pilots had died in an accident. The truth was too damaging to morale. It showed that the sophisticated air defense system was flawed. It showed that the pilots were not infallible, and it created a deep sense of mistrust and anxiety within fighter command. For the rest of the war, every pilot had a nagging fear in the back of his mind. Was that dot in the distance a German? Or was it one of ours? The problem of aircraft identification plagued both sides. The Germans painted the noses and wingtips of their fighters bright yellow to help them stand out. The British painted the undersides of their wings half black and half white for the same reason, but mistakes still happened. The fear of friendly fire, as documented in military studies on combat stress, is a unique and corrosive kind of fear. The idea that the greatest threat might come from your own comrades is a psychological burden that is hard to bear. The Battle of Barking Creek was a harsh lesson learned at the very beginning. It forced the RAF to rapidly improve its identification procedures and command and control. But it was a secret, shameful start to the air war. The first victory of the war for the Spitfire was against a Hurricane. It's an unbelievable and tragic irony. The first casualty was a result not of enemy action, but of panic, technology, and human error. What do we still not know about this incident? How flawed was the early radar system, and were there other similar false alarms that almost led to disaster? Was there a formal court-martial for the pilots involved, and if so, what was the verdict and where are the records? How many other friendly fire incidents occurred during the Battle of Britain that were successfully covered up and remain hidden in classified archives? Number 5. How do you fight a battle in your own head? We count the cost of battle in planes lost and pilots killed. But there is another cost, one that is harder to measure. This is the psychological toll. The men who flew in the Battle of Britain were subjected to a level of stress that is almost unimaginable. They lived on a knife's edge day after day, and for many the strain became too much. Pilots were in a constant state of readiness. They would sit in deck chairs by their aircraft, waiting for the scramble bell. When it rang, they had to go from a state of rest to full combat alert in seconds. The adrenaline surge was immense. In the air, they faced sensory overload, the noise, the vibration, the fear, the constant need to scan the sky for threats. A moment's inattention could mean death. Then they would land, their bodies shaking with adrenaline, only to be told to refuel and go up again. This relentless cycle broke men. The condition was known by many names: combat fatigue, operational exhaustion, or simply the twitch. It manifested in different ways. Some pilots became overly aggressive and reckless. Others became hesitant and timid. Many couldn't sleep. They had nightmares. Their hands would shake uncontrollably. Their confidence, the single most important asset for a fighter pilot, would evaporate. The story of Jeffrey Page is a powerful example. He was a young Hurricane pilot who was shot down in flames in August 1940. He bailed out but suffered horrific burns to his hands and face. His ordeal was just beginning. He endured months of painful surgery and rehabilitation. He became one of the first patients of the pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe, whose work at the Queen Victoria Hospital became legendary. Page and his fellow burned airmen formed the Guinea Pig Club. But Page's physical recovery was only part of his battle. In his book, Tale of a Guinea Pig, he describes the deep psychological scars, the memory of the fire, the fear, the helplessness. He was determined to fly again. Incredibly, he did. Despite his injuries, he returned to combat flying later in the war. But he was fighting a second battle, a battle against his own trauma. His story shows the immense resilience of these pilots, but also the hidden wounds they carried. The RAF command was slow to understand the problem. Initially, a pilot showing signs of stress was often viewed as lacking moral fiber, a coward. But as the battle wore on and more good men broke down, they had to accept that every pilot had a limit. They began to rotate squadrons out of the front line to quieter sectors to give them a rest. But for the pilots of 11 Group, during the height of the battle, there was no rest. The RAF was losing pilots faster than they could be trained. They needed every man. The unbelievable part of this story is not that some men broke. It's that so many endured for so long. They were running on reserves of courage, adrenaline, and loyalty to their squadron mates. But they were paying a high price, one that many would continue to pay for the rest of their lives, long after the skies fell silent. What are the true unrecorded numbers of pilots who were grounded for combat fatigue? How many suicides or accidents were actually the result of psychological breakdown? And what long-term psychological effects, like PTSD, did the surviving pilots of the few have to live with in a world that didn't yet understand the condition? Number 4, did a ghost plane fly over Kent? In the heat and stress of battle, people see things. The mind can play tricks. During the Battle of Britain, with the entire nation on edge, strange stories and rumors were common. One of the most persistent and unbelievable was the legend of the ghost plane. There are several variations of the story. The most common one tells of a biplane, an old Gloucester Gladiator, or a similar outdated aircraft, appearing in the sky during the height of a dogfight. It would fly into the middle of the chaos, engage the enemy, and then vanish as mysteriously as it appeared. Some versions of the myth claim it was a lone pilot, perhaps the ghost of a fallen airman from an earlier war, returning to defend his homeland. Another version of the story is tied to the Dunkirk evacuation, which happened just before the Battle of Britain. During that desperate retreat, a story circulated about a phantom RAF fighter that protected the British troops on the beaches. This legend may have carried over into the battle itself. These stories are, of course, almost certainly folklore. There is no official record of such an event. In his comprehensive analysis of the battle, historian Derek Wood makes no mention of ghost planes. The logical explanations are numerous. It could have been a misidentified aircraft, a lone British fighter separated from its squadron. It could have been a story invented to boost morale, a modern version of the Angles of Mons legend from the First World War, where angelic figures were said to have protected British soldiers. But why did this particular legend take hold? Perhaps it was because the battle itself felt so desperate. The idea of supernatural help, of a guardian angel in the sky, was a comforting thought in a dark time. It spoke to a deep-seated need for hope when the odds seemed impossible. The pilots themselves were sometimes seen as almost mythical figures, so the idea of a ghostly counterpart was not such a great leap of the imagination. The story of the ghost plane is a reminder that the Battle of Britain was not just a military event. It was a psychological one. It was a battle of nerves, of morale, and of belief. The entire country was living through a period of intense fear and patriotic fervor. In that atmosphere, myths are born. The unbelievable story of the ghost plane tells us less about the reality of the air war and more about the state of mind of the people on the ground, who were looking up at the sky and praying for a miracle. They created their own, but what if there is more to it? Are there any pilot diaries or letters still undiscovered in an attic somewhere that mention seeing a mysterious, unidentified aircraft? Could a lone, eccentric pilot have been flying an unauthorized private plane into combat, his actions later mythologized? How many other local legends and myths about the battle were there that have now been completely forgotten? Number 3 was the battle won in a car factory. The Spitfire is the icon of the Battle of Britain. It was a beautiful, deadly machine, but a fighter plane is useless without factories to build it and mechanics to repair it. The battle in the air was completely dependent on a battle on the ground, the battle of production, and the man in charge of it was a Canadian newspaper baron named Lord Beaverbrook. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, he created a new position, Minister of Aircraft Production. He gave the job to his friend Max Aiken, Lord Beaverbrook. Beaverbrook was a ruthless, energetic, and controversial figure. He was not a man for rules and procedures. His only goal was to build more planes, and he didn't care whose toes he stepped on to do it. He took over an industry that was bogged down in bureaucracy. He stormed through it like a hurricane. He fired people, he shouted at factory managers, he set impossible targets, and then demanded they be met. His motto was planes, not programs. He wanted fighters rolling off the assembly line now, not perfect plans for the future. One of his most famous initiatives was the Saucepan Appeal. He asked the public, especially the women of Britain, to donate their aluminum pots and pans to be melted down to build Spitfires. From a purely industrial perspective, the appeal was mostly for propaganda. The amount of high-grade aluminum collected was small, but as a way of making the entire country feel involved in the war effort, it was a stroke of genius. Everyone felt they were helping to build the planes that were saving them. Beaverbrook's real genius was in organization and improvisation. The main Spitfire factory was in Southampton. It was a huge target for German bombers. Beaverbrook knew he had to disperse production. He set up dozens of small shadow factories all over the country. They were in bus depots, car showrooms, and small workshops. Parts of a Spitfire would be built in one town and other parts in another. They would then be brought together for final assembly. This made the production line much harder for the Luftwaffe to destroy. He also focused heavily on repairs. A damaged fighter was almost as good as a new one if you could get it flying again quickly. He created a huge repair organization that would salvage wrecked aircraft, cannibalize them for parts, and get patched up planes back to the squadrons. During the battle, more than half of the RAF's frontline strength was made up of repaired aircraft. This was Beaverbrook's hidden contribution. The Germans were counting planes destroyed, but they weren't counting the ones that were being brought back to life. Beaverbrook's methods were brutal. He fought constantly with the Air Ministry, which he saw as a slow-moving bureaucracy. But he got results. In the crucial summer months of 1940, British aircraft production outstripped German production. This was an unbelievable achievement. The RAF was losing planes at a terrifying rate, but thanks to Beaverbrook and the thousands of factory workers, they were being replaced even faster. He didn't design the Spitfire, but he made sure there were enough of them in the sky when it mattered most. What do we still not know about this industrial war? How many dangerous shortcuts were taken in the factories to meet Beaverbrook's targets, and did they lead to mechanical failures in the air? Were there acts of industrial sabotage that were covered up? And what was the real human cost for the factory workers, many of them women, who worked grueling hours under the constant threat of being bombed? Number 2. Why would you fire the man who won? Well, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was the architect of the victory. He was the commander of RAF Fighter Command. He built the integrated air defense system. He managed his scarce resources with skill and prudence throughout the battle. He resisted the political pressure to send more fighters to France before it fell, saving them for the defense of Britain. He made the right strategic calls at the most critical moments. He was the man who won the Battle of Britain. And in November 1940, just weeks after the battle was won, he was dismissed from his post. It is one of the great injustices of the war. Why was he fired? The answer is complicated. It's a story of politics, personality clashes, and professional jealousy. Dowding was not a politician. He was quiet, reserved, and socially awkward. Some found him aloof and difficult to work with. He did not suffer fools gladly, and he was not good at playing the political games of the Air Ministry. He was known as Stuffy Dowding, and the nickname was not always meant affectionately. Throughout the battle, he had powerful enemies. The main ones were Trafford, Leigh Mallory, and his supporters in the Big Wing camp. They were constantly lobbying against Dowding and his key subordinate, Keith Park. They argued that Dowding's tactics were too defensive and not aggressive enough. They presented their Big Wing theory as a bold, war-winning strategy. After the battle, their voices grew louder. They managed to convince key figures in the Air Ministry that Dowding and Park had mismanaged the campaign. The official reason given for Dowding's removal was his age, and the fact that he had been in his post for a long time. But the real reason was the internal politics of the RAF. As documented by his biographer Robert Wright, Dowding was outmaneuvered by his rivals. He had focused on fighting the war, while they had focused on fighting him. Keith Park, the brilliant commander of 11 Group, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, was also removed. He was sent to a training command. It was a shocking way to treat the two men who had been most responsible for the victory. The winners of the political battle, Leigh Mallory and his allies, took over. Dowding was deeply hurt by his dismissal. He was given a minor role and then quietly retired. He was never given the public recognition he deserved during his lifetime. There was no victory parade for him. Churchill, while admiring Dowding's work, was a political realist. He did not intervene to save him. The unbelievable truth is that the hero of the Battle of Britain was cast aside almost as soon as the danger had passed. He was a wartime leader, and in the bureaucratic battles of peacetime, he was an easy target. His victory was his undoing. What secret memos and minutes of meetings still exist that detail the conspiracy to remove Dowding? How much did Churchill know about the infighting, and did he sacrifice Dowding for the sake of political unity in the RAF? And if Dowding and Park had been allowed to remain in command, how might the subsequent air campaigns of the war have been fought differently? Number 1, what if the few is the wrong story? Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Winston Churchill's words on August 20th, 1940 are immortal. They created the legend of the Battle of Britain, the image of a handful of brave pilots, the few, saving the nation from invasion. It's a powerful and inspiring story. But what if it's not the whole truth? The legend focuses on the pilots. Just under 3,000 of them flew for Fighter Command during the battle. They were undoubtedly brave, but the idea that they were the only ones who mattered is a myth. As we have seen, the victory was a collective effort. It belonged to the radar operators, the plotters in the filter rooms, the mechanics who worked through the night to repair damaged planes, the civilian observer corps, the factory workers, and the strategists like Dowding who built the system. The pilot was just the final sharp end of a very long and complex spear. The myth also simplifies the battle. It presents it as a clear-cut victory, a single, decisive event. In reality, as modern historians like Richard Overy argue, the outcome was more ambiguous. The German High Command had never been fully committed to an invasion of Britain. The plan, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was always a risky proposition. The failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority was certainly the final nail in its coffin, but the invasion may never have happened anyway. The myth also creates a distorted view of the pilots themselves. It paints them as chivalrous knights, a band of brothers. In reality, they were a diverse group of individuals. There was comradeship, but there was also tension, fear, and rivalry. They were not a single entity, but a collection of tired, stressed young men doing a dangerous job. The greatest power of the EU myth was its use as propaganda. It gave Britain a story of heroism and defiance at its darkest hour. It was a story the country needed to hear. It united the nation and inspired hope. It was a necessary legend. But legends can be dangerous. They can obscure the more complex and often more interesting truths. They can make us forget the contributions of the thousands of many on the ground who made the actions of the few possible. The unbelievable story of the Battle of Britain is not just the story of the 2,937 pilots. It's the story of a system. It's the story of a vast interconnected network of people and technology. The pilot in his Spitfire was the hero, but his heroism would have been useless without the WAF plotter who guided him, the mechanic who armed his guns, and the factory worker who built his wings. The real story is bigger, messier, and more incredible than the legend we've been told. So what is the final unanswered question? If the myth of the few is so powerful, what other necessary legends from history do we accept as fact? How does our need for simple, heroic stories prevent us from understanding the complex reality of the past? And in celebrating the few, have we done a disservice to the many whose names we will never know?